artificially, not in hope of enlightenment, but because this was the proper labor of an enlightened human being. Under such conditions, we do know that there were mystics, and great mystics arise among these different groups. But these mystics were persons who had slowly unfolded. They had lived each step of the common life. They had grown skillful and wise in the philosophy of the doctrine. They had gone out and dedicated themselves to the service of others over long periods of time. They had gained practical insight as working with the sick and as helping to solve the problems of the burdened. They had become the counselors of rulers and the friends of princes. They had helped in the creation of good laws. They had helped to perfect arts and sciences. Many of them actually gave skills to their peoples. And Kobodaishi, who was one of the great monks of the Shingon-shu in Japan, is accredited with having given almost as many inventions to the Japanese people as Leonardo da Vinci gave to Europe. A tremendous genius in his own right. He was not a person who had simply decided to be spiritual. He had worked and labored and studied. He had lived with the wise. He made the long and at that time dangerous journey to China in order to come closer to the great seats of the doctrines. He was a master of knowledge, one of the most perfectly informed men of his time, and still regarded as one of the most enlightened men of Asia. These people grew sincerely. They gave everything they had to growth. And they grew not just simply for the sake of being wise themselves, but that they might become the founders of essential and practical movements and organizations. They were great mathematicians, great artists, great musicians, poets, men of literature and letters. And out of the temples and the shrines and the sanctuaries came the great arts, the great modelings and sculpturings, the casting in bronze and in silver. These people were highly skilled. They took the attitude that the more able they became in everyday labor, the more completely they were able to express their spiritual convictions. So that they worked with the law. They became better, realizing that the reward of being better is to know more. The reward of greater daily virtue is enlightenment. That there are really no tricks in this thing at all. By the time they reached the point, as in Zenshu or in the Shingon-shu or Tendai-shu, where certain esoteric disciplines were recommended or given to them by their teachers, these disciples were so well grounded in every principle of ethics, in their knowledge of the universal structure and the operations of all the laws of nature, that it would be virtually impossible for them to make a mistake. They had all the groundwork in, all the principles thoroughly established. Usually, in Zen, not much of an esoteric nature was divulged under 20 years of discipleship. And that discipleship was more rigorous than anything that we can imagine. It was constant self-analysis, the breaking down of every illusion and delusion in consciousness. And by the time the disciple was ready to go on, he had truly cleaned his own inner life. It was well disciplined and well ordered. People that have this degree of insight can probably be trusted, and you seldom if ever hear of anyone in this type of level of activity who ever perverted what he knew or contributed to the corruption of anyone else. These people knew. and they were able to use their knowledge wisely. What we are worried about constantly and stricken about so often is the dabbler, the one who really tries, but simply doesn't even have a comprehension of what he's trying. To him, a few lessons and a couple of books, and he's well on his way to nirvana. It just doesn't operate that way. This does not mean, however, that the individual cannot grow. He can grow continuously. But he has to grow with a dedication, not an enthusiasm alone. He has to grow along the line which is the most difficult of all forms, and that is self-discipline and self-control. I know more people who have tried to be spiritual without taking hold of their own lives. They can do almost anything you can imagine except what they should be doing, and that is controlling and directing their own conduct. These people are perfectly willing to devote a great deal of time to wandering about the cosmos, but they cannot be patient as people. They do not know how. They cannot really be thoughtful. I know many of them that cannot even be commonly courteous. There is no attention to personal character. This is something to be left behind, to be hurdled, to be considered fit only for persons of less spiritual insight. There is no spiritual insight apart from character. There is no safe mystical experience apart from character. There is no possibility of man exploring the inner universe of value safely unless his own integrity is completely established. Any other course of procedure is bound to lead ultimately to difficulty. And because no one but the individual himself knows the degree of his insight, each person has to come to some way of judging these things. You cannot tell him that he isn't ready. He will keep on going around until he finds someone else who tells him he is ready. And this goes on and on because the person wants to believe that he's on the verge of enlightenment. He doesn't want to be told he hasn't started yet. So you can't convince people against their will. And yet, because of this peculiar type of religious thinking that has developed, people just get themselves into trouble and have no way out. And by the time they realize the degree of their trouble, the very persons who got them into the trouble can't do a thing for them. So they wander about, hoping for someone who can perform a miracle and rescue them from the dilemma into which they have gotten themselves. By this time, perhaps they do have a little experience. It will serve them in good stead in due time, but at the moment they're in a very uncomfortable state about the whole thing. So we can only profoundly warn the individual that when he starts dabbling with mysterious things, he must either have the consciousness to handle these things, or he should leave them alone. And no one who is frightened out of his wits by every psychic wind that blows is in a condition to handle the problem. No one who has to seek help is in a condition to handle it. Therefore, if this situation seems to be developing, there can be only one answer. Get out of it as quickly as you possibly can and get your feet back on the ground again. Use the simple ways. Realize that this whole problem of what you might term psychic involvement is only possible at all because basically the person is not capable of thinking with true